The Montana sky was a cruel, mocking shade of blue today. It was the kind of sky that promised forever, which was ironic considering my life was about to be burned to the ground in front of 300 of the Northwest's wealthiest elites. I stood at the altar of the Blackwood Estate's private chapel, a masterpiece of glass and reclaimed cedar that I had designed. My hands, hidden behind my back, were trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from exhaustion. For 3 years I had poured every ounce of my soul, my architectural talent, and my inheritance into this land. I had saved the Blackwood cattle empire from the brink of Chapter 11. I had turned their rotten ranch into a world-class luxury destination. I looked at Clara Blackwood as she floated down the aisle. She looked like an angel in a $40,000 Vera Wang gown, a gown I had paid for. Her father, Silas Blackwood, walked her down the aisle with a stiff military gait. He was a man who smelled of expensive bourbon and old money, even though 3 years ago he was crying in my office because the banks were seizing his tractors. As Clara reached the altar, I reached out to take her hand. She pulled away. The music stopped. Not the soft fade of a planned transition, but the jar and silence of a record needle being ripped across vinyl. "Ethan," Clara said. Her voice wasn't the sweet, melodic tone I'd fallen in love with. It was cold. It was the sound of a closing vault. "Don't." I frowned, a cold pit forming in my stomach. "Clara, what's going on?" Silas stepped forward, not to join our hands, but to stand between us. He adjusted his silk bolo tie and turned to face the crowd. The creme de la creme of Billings and Bozeman leaned forward in their pews, sensing blood in the water. "Friends, family, business associates," Silas's voice boomed through the chapel. "Today was supposed to be a merger, but a Blackwood doesn't merge with a servant. We've spent 3 years watching this architect play house on our land. We let him fix the fences. We let him balance the books. We even let him think he was part of the family." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "But," Silas continued, looking at me with pure, unadulterated venom, "Ethan, let's be honest. You're a builder. You're help. You really thought a girl like me, a girl who grew up on a 100,000-acre dynasty, would actually spend her life with a man who has dirt under his fingernails? You were a means to an end. You saved the ranch. Thank you for that. But the ranch needs a king, not a handyman." From the front row, a man stood up. It was Preston Montgomery, the son of the biggest banking magnate in the state. He was wearing a smug, punchable grin. He walked up to the altar and slid his arm around Clara's waist. "The wedding is still happening," Silas announced, his voice filled with triumph. "But the groom has changed. Clara will be marrying Preston today. The Montgomery Bank has agreed to clear the remaining debts of the Blackwood estate, debts that you, Ethan, were too slow to handle." I stood there, stripped bare in front of everyone I knew. My mother was in the second row, her face white with shock, her eyes filling with tears of humiliation for her son. "You're firing me?" I asked, my voice surprisingly quiet. "In our wedding day? In the house I built for you?" "Firing you," laughed Silas, a dry, rasping sound. "We're evicting you. Your things are already in garbage bags at the gate. We've already filed a restraining order. You have 5 minutes to leave this property before my security team tosses you over the cattle guard." Clara leaned in, whispering so only I could hear. "Don't look so hurt, Ethan. You got to sleep in a Blackwood bed for 3 years. That's more than a man of your station could ever dream of. Now go back to your little sketches. Leave the empire to the professionals." Preston pulled a stack of hundreds from his pocket and threw them at my feet. "For the trouble, buddy, buy yourself a new hammer." The guests began to clap. Some of them stood up. They weren't just cheering for Clara and Preston. They were cheering for the restoration of the natural order. The poor boy had been kicked out, and the rich girl was back with her own kind. I looked at the bills on the floor.
I looked at Clara's mocking smile. I looked at Silas's arrogant posture. I felt something break inside me. It wasn't my heart. It was the last shred of my patience. "You're right, Silas," I said, loud enough for the microphone on the altar to catch it. The room went quiet again. "Every tool has its use, and you've used me quite well." I leaned down and picked up one of the $100 bills. I looked at it, then tucked it into Silas's breast pocket. "But there's one thing you forgot about architects, Silas," I whispered, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "We don't just build houses. We know exactly where the load-bearing walls are, and we know which single brick to pull to make the whole thing scream as it collapses." Silas sneered. "Get him out of here." 2 massive security guards grabbed my arms. They dragged me down the aisle, my boots scuffing the flower petals Clara had just walked on. They threw me out the heavy oak doors and into the dirt of the driveway. As I lay there in the dust, the sounds of the new wedding beginning inside, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My face was bruised, my tuxedo ruined, but my thumb was steady. I opened an app, a private, encrypted portal for a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. "Operation Termite," I muttered. "Activate." For 3 years, they thought I was saving their ranch. What they didn't know was that I was buying it. Every debt Silas thought Preston was going to pay, I already owned the notes. Every acre of land Silas thought was his, I had leveraged the Blackwood name to secure the titles under my own corporation. I wasn't just the architect of their house, I was the architect of their extirpation.
Silas Blackwood was a man who had spent 60 years believing that the world bowed to his name. As he lunged at me, his face a contorted mask of purple rage, he wasn't just trying to hit a man. He was trying to strike down the reality that his empire was a house of cards. The sheriff didn't hesitate. He stepped into Silas's path, catching the older man's wrists with practiced ease and pinning him behind his back. The king of the Blackwoods was forced face down against the hood of my truck, the same truck he had called peasant transport just months prior. "Silas, don't make this a felony," the sheriff warned, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the silent driveway. "He's a thief," Silas screamed, his mouth pressed against the cold metal. "I didn't have to manipulate anything, Silas. I just had to stop hiding the truth for you. You were so busy looking down on me that you didn't notice the leaks in your own boat." I turned to look at Clara. She was shivering, her expensive gown dragging in the Montana dust. The bridesmaids who had spent the morning whispering about my quaint background were now scurrying away like rats from a sinking ship. "Preston, help him!" Clara shrieked, but the Porsche's engine roared in the distance. Preston was gone. He was a Montgomery. They didn't do sinking ships. The direct confrontation. I pulled a small, weather-beaten leather ledger from my pocket. This wasn't a digital file. This was the handwritten record Silas kept in his private study, the one he thought I never looked at while I was fixing his Wi-Fi. "You talked about ethics, Silas. You talked about station. But let's talk about the cattle insurance fraud at 2024, I said, my voice echoing for the remaining guests to hear. Silas went still. The rage vanished, replaced by a sudden hollow vacuum of fear. "You reported 300 head of Black Angus lost to a blizzard in February," I continued, flipping through the pages. "You collected a $2 million payout from State Farm, but the GPS tags I installed on the herd as part of the efficiency upgrades you approved, those 300 cows weren't dead. They were moved under the cover of night to a private lot in Idaho owned by your brother-in-law." The sheriff looked at Silas, his expression darkening. "Is that true, Silas? Federal insurance fraud?" "He's lying," Silas whimpered.
I planted that. The GPS logs don't lie, Silas, and neither does the bank account in the Cayman Islands you used to funnel the insurance money to pay for this very wedding. I looked at Clara. Your father didn't rebuild this dynasty. He stole the bricks from the federal government, and he used me to mortar 'em together. Clara backed away, her hands over her mouth. I didn't know. I had nothing to do with this. You spent the money, Clara, I said, stepping toward her. The dress, the jewelry, the European honeymoon that's now canceled, it was all paid for with blood and fraud. You aren't a victim. You're an accomplice who was too greedy to ask where the money came from. That moment, a black sedan pulled up and a man in a sharp government-issued suit stepped out. This wasn't the local police. This was an agent from the USDA's Office of Inspector General. Ethan Miller? The agent asked. Right here, I said, handing over the leather ledger and a thumb drive. Everything is there. The movement logs, the falsified death certificates for the livestock, and the wire transfer receipts. The agent turned to Silas. Silas Blackwood, you are under arrest for federal insurance fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. As they pulled Silas off the hood of my truck and led him toward the sedan, the reality finally shattered. The Blackwood name wasn't just bankrupt, it was radioactive. But I wasn't done. The trap had one more layer. Ethan, Clara ran toward me, grabbing the lapels of my tuxedo. Please, talk to him. Tell him it was a mistake. I'll marry you. We can forget Preston. We can go back to the way it was. You're the CEO of Vanguard now. We can be the most powerful couple in the state. I looked down at her hands, the hands I once wanted to hold forever. Now they just looked desperate. You really think this is about the money, Clara? I asked, gently unpeeling her fingers from my suit. You were just pressured. My father made me. No, I interrupted. Your father gave you a choice between a man who loved you and a man who had a bank. You chose the bank. Now you've lost both. I turned to the sheriff. Is the property cleared? Every guest is gone, Ethan. It's just them now. Good. I pulled a heavy iron key from my pocket, the master key to the Blackwood Manor. As the primary creditor in a federal fraud case, I'm asserting my right to secure the asset. Clara, you have 10 minutes to get whatever personal items you can carry in your arms. Everything else, the furniture, the art, the clothes I paid for, is being inventoried as part of the asset seizure. You're kicking me out now? It's getting dark. There's a Motel 6 miles down the road, I said, repeating the words Silas had said to me an hour ago. Maybe they have a room for a carpenter, or maybe you can call Preston. I hear he's very good at handling things. Clara stood in the middle of the driveway as the sun dipped below the jagged Montana peaks. Her father was in a federal car, her fiancé was gone, and her home was now a crime scene owned by the man she had humiliated. I walked back to the chapel, the glass and cedar cathedral I had built for a lie. I stood at the altar and looked at the $400 bottle of vintage champagne Preston had opened before the alarm fire. I poured myself a glass, but I didn't drink it. I poured it out onto the floor. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. Ethan, we have a problem. Silas's brother-in-law in Idaho, he just called. He says he has something on you, something you did during the construction. He's claiming you didn't just build the ranch. He says you sabotaged the foundation to make sure it would fail if they ever tried to sell it. He's calling it premeditated sabotage. The feds are listening. I looked down at the floor of the chapel. A small, almost invisible crack was beginning to form in the polished concrete near the altar. I smiled. The revenge was working perfectly, but the fire I had started was now threatening to jump the line.
The dust of the Blackwood driveway was still settling on my ruined tuxedo as the muffled sounds of pomp and circumstance drifted from the chapel. They were actually doing it. They were continuing the ceremony with Preston Montgomery as if I were nothing more than a discarded piece of scaffolding. I didn't head for the gate where my belongings sat in trash bags. Instead, I walked to my black Ram 3500 parked near the stables. My ribs ached where the security guards had gripped me, and my pride was a raw, bleeding wound. But as I sat in the driver's seat, a cold, clinical clarity took over. For 3 years, Silas Blackwood thought he was playing me. He thought he was the genius who tricked a talented, naive architect into rebuilding his legacy for free. What he didn't realize was that I had spent those 3 years studying the rot, not just in the wood of his barns, but in the ledger of his soul. I pulled out my laptop and connected to the ranch's internal server. As the lead architect and project manager, I had designed the entire digital infrastructure of the new Blackwood estate. I didn't just have the keys, I owned the locks. "Let's see how much the Montgomery name is actually worth," I whispered. The paper fortress. Silas believed that Preston's father, Elias Montgomery, was his savior. He thought the Montgomery Bank was going to swallow the $45 million in debt the ranch had accumulated. But Silas was an old-school cattleman. He didn't understand how modern debt shuffling worked. Over the last 18 months, I had used my own inheritance, money my grandfather had left me from his days in the oil fields, to quietly buy up the distressed paper on the Blackwood estate. I didn't do it under my name. I did it through Vanguard Land Holdings, a shell company Silas thought was a partner of the Montgomerys. In reality, I owned 60% of the ranch's primary debt. The Montgomerys only owned the remaining 40%, and according to the ironclad lead creditor clause I had slipped into the restructuring contract Silas signed while he was drunk on his own ego, the holder of the majority debt had the right to call in the full balance if there was a significant change in management or ownership. A wedding was a change in management. A new groom was a change in ownership. I hit a sequence of keys, sending a formal notice of default to the Blackwood Estates legal team and the Montgomery Bank. Then I made a second call. "Marcus?" "Ready and waiting, Ethan," my lawyer replied. "I saw the live-streamed photos of the new wedding. They really did it, didn't they?" "They did. Is the injunction ready?" "Signed by a judge 10 minutes ago. Since you provided proof that the Blackwoods used the funds you personally invested, funds they misclassified as donations, to pay for this wedding, you have a legal freeze on all estate festivities. You aren't just an ex-fiancé, Ethan. You were their largest unpaid contractor and their primary creditor. You have the right to halt all operations on the property to protect your assets." "Do it," I said, "and call the sheriff. Tell him there's a massive civil disturbance at Blackwood Estate." I sat in my truck and watched. 20 minutes later, the music in the chapel didn't just stop. It was cut off by the scream of a fire alarm I had triggered remotely. The heavy oak doors burst open. The guests spilled out, coughing from the harmless but thick theatrical fog I had released through the HVAC system. Behind them came Clara, her white dress stained with soot, and Silas, his face a deep, dangerous purple. Preston was right behind them, looking confused and panicked. "What is the meaning of this?" Silas roared, looking around the driveway. He spotted my truck. I put it in gear and drove slowly toward the crowd, stopping just feet from the happy couple. I stepped out, leaning against the hood, looking every bit the handyman they had mocked. "Just a little safety inspection, Silas," I said, loud enough for the trembling socialites to hear.
You see, the building permit for this chapel was issued to Ethan Miller Construction. Since the contract was terminated without cause 5 minutes ago, the insurance is void. It's a liability to have this many people inside an unstable structure. "You're insane," Clara shrieked, clutching Preston's arm. "Preston, do something. Call your father." Preston stepped forward, trying to look brave. "Listen, Miller, my father is the chairman of Montgomery Bank. We just cleared the Blackwood debt. You're trespassing on Montgomery-funded land. Get out before I have you arrested." I smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already won. That's the thing about banks, Preston. They like to sell their debt to make a quick profit. Your father's bank sold the majority of the Blackwood notes to Vanguard Land Holdings 6 months ago. Preston's face went pale. "What? No, that was an internal transfer." "Check your email, Preston. Vanguard just called in the full $45 million, and since the Blackwoods obviously don't have it, and your father's bank is currently being audited for the illegal side deal you made to facilitate this wedding, well, things are getting complicated." At that moment, 3 county sheriff vehicles pulled up the long, winding drive, their sirens wailing. "Sheriff," Silas shouted, pointing at me, "arrest this man. He's harassing my guests and sabotaging my property." The sheriff, a man I'd shared many cups of coffee with during the construction of the new barns, stepped out of his car. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at me. "Ethan, you okay?" "I'm fine, Sheriff. Just here to serve some papers." The sheriff turned to Silas. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not here to arrest Ethan. I'm here to oversee a peaceful transfer of assets. I have a court order here stating that Vanguard Land Holdings has been granted temporary receivership of the Blackwood estate due to a massive breach of credit terms." "Receivership," Clara whispered. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, stepping closer to her, "that every chair these people are sitting on, the wine they're drinking, the very dress on your back, it all belongs to Vanguard. And since I'm the CEO of Vanguard, I'm deciding that the party is over." Silas staggered back, clutching his chest. "You bought us? With what money?" "With the money my family made in oil before you were even born, Silas. I came here to build something real with you. I would have given you everything for free because I loved your daughter, but you wanted a tool, not a son." I looked at the crowd of guests, the vultures who laughed when I was dragged out. "The bar is closed. The catering is canceled. Please vacate the premises immediately. If you're not off the property in 15 minutes, your cars will be towed at your own expense." As the guests began a frantic scramble for their luxury SUVs, I turned to Clara. She was shaking, her eyes darting between me and Preston. "Preston," she pleaded, "tell him he's lying. Tell him your father'll fix this." Preston didn't look at her. He was staring at his phone, his hands trembling. "My father just messaged me. The bank's board just held an emergency vote. They're severing ties with the Blackwoods to avoid the scandal. Clara, I have to go." "Preston," she screamed, but Preston Montgomery, the king Silas had chosen, was already jogging toward his Porsche, leaving his queen standing in the dirt. I walked up to the altar, the one I had built, and picked up the gold-plated wedding bell. I rang it once, a sharp clanging sound that echoed through the valley. "End of part 1 of the auction," I said to Silas. "Part 2 is where I take your house." But as I turned to walk away, Silas let out a roar of rage and lunged for me. He didn't see the sheriff move, and he didn't see the second piece of evidence I was holding in my left hand, the evidence that would turn this from a civil dispute into a criminal nightmare.
The cool Montana evening air rushed through the open windows of the chapel, carrying the scent of pine and the bitter metallic tang of the fire suppression foam. I stared at the text from Marcus, the crack in the concrete, a hairline fracture I had engineered during the pouring of the foundation,
was a physical manifestation of my insurance policy. Silas's brother-in-law, Jim Van Camp, was a snake who lived for litigation. He thought he had found my Achilles heel. If I had intentionally sabotaged the structural integrity of the Blackwood estate, my hero narrative would crumble into a criminal conspiracy. I'd go from a wronged man to a domestic terrorist in the eyes of the law. But Jim was playing checkers. I was playing 4D chess with a grandmaster's clock. The Reckoning. Clara burst back into the chapel, her mascara running, her white dress torn at the hem. She had seen the sheriff and the feds talking near the truck. "You did it, didn't you?" she spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and newfound venom. "Jim just called me. You didn't just buy the debt, Ethan. You rigged this place to fall. You're just as dirty as my father." I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the altar. Dirty, Clara? No. I'm thorough. When I build something, I ensure it serves its purpose. This chapel was built to host a union based on love and trust. Since that foundation was a lie, why should the building stand? The feds are coming back up the hill. They're going to arrest you for sabotage. You're going to jail right next to my father. I finally turned to her. I wasn't panicked. I was almost bored. "Tell me, Clara, did Jim tell you how I sabotaged it, or did he just tell you what he thought he saw on the blueprints?" Outside, the crunch of gravel signaled the return of the black sedans. The USDA agent and the sheriff walked back into the chapel, their faces set in grim lines. "Mr. Sterling," the agent began, using my real name now, "we've just received a sworn statement from a contractor in Idaho. He claims you intentionally compromised the load-bearing beams and the foundation of this multi-million-dollar structure. If true, that's reckless endangerment and insurance fraud on your part." I leaned against the cedar pillar. "Agent, I'm an architect. I don't compromise beams. I optimize them. What Jim Van Camp calls sabotage is actually a highly advanced seismic dampening system. Because this estate sits on a minor fault line, which Silas conveniently forgot to disclose during the initial survey, I had to build the foundation to be modular." I pulled a small remote from my pocket. It looked like a car key fob. If I had built it traditionally, the fraud Silas committed by using subpar, uncured timber would have caused this roof to collapse on your guests' heads today. I saved their lives. I handed a second thumb drive to the agent. "On this drive, you'll find the real blueprints, the ones Silas rejected because they were too expensive, and you'll find the off-book orders Silas made behind my back for the cheaper, dangerous materials. I didn't sabotage the building, agent. I installed a fail-safe to prevent Silas's greed from killing someone. Jim Van Camp provided the subpar materials from his own lumber yard. That's why he's talking. He's trying to cover his own tracks." The sheriff looked at the crack in the floor, then at the agent. The tide turned instantly. Jim Van Camp hadn't just snitched. He'd accidentally confessed to being the supplier of the illegal, dangerous materials that Silas used to embezzle the construction budget. "Wait," Silas stammered. "You mean the house is safe?" "It's safe because I fixed it with my own money," I said, my voice rising. "But it's only safe as long as I maintain the hydraulic stabilizers. And since I'm now the owner, I think I'll just turn them off. The house won't fall, but it will be legally uninhabitable for the next decade while it's tied up in your father's criminal trial." The agent nodded to the sheriff. "Get Van Camp on the phone. Tell him we're on our way to Idaho to inspect his yard. And Silas, add endangerment to his list of charges." As the authorities led the investigation away, leaving me alone with the woman who had traded my soul for a Montgomery bank account, the silence was deafening. Clara looked around the darkened chapel. The lights flickered and died. I'd cut the power to the main house. The only light left was the pale silver glow of the moon reflecting off the glass walls. "What am I supposed to do, Ethan?" she asked, her voice small, a broken whisper. "I have no money, no home. My father is in jail. Preston isn't answering my calls. You've taken everything." "I didn't take it. I just stopped giving it to you. You had a life built on my labor, my talent, and my protection. You called it your station. Well, this is your new station." I reached the door and turned back. "The trash bags with your things are at the gate. I took the liberty of removing the designer jewelry. It's being appraised to pay back the workmen you and your father stiffed last Christmas. I left you the jeans you wore when we first met. They're the only things in your life that weren't bought with a lie." "You're a monster," she hissed, her eyes burning with a final, desperate hatred. "No, I'm just the architect, and I just finished the demolition phase. Tomorrow, the rebuilding starts, but you won't be in the plans." I walked out and locked the massive oak doors from the outside. I climbed into my truck and drove toward the gate. As I passed the trash bags, I saw her standing in the rear-view mirror, a tiny white figure in a ruined wedding dress surrounded by the vast, dark Montana wilderness that no longer belonged to her. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. "It's over. File the final foreclosure on the Blackwood name. I want the brand dissolved by morning. And Marcus, call the local animal shelter. Tell him the Blackwood Ranch is being converted into a non-profit sanctuary for abandoned horses. We're going to turn this place into something that actually has a heart." I felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. The handyman had dismantled the dynasty, and the ground was finally level.
6 months later, the Blackwood estate no longer existed. The gold-leafed signs at the entrance had been torn down and replaced with a simple rustic archway that read, "The Miller Sanctuary." I stood on the porch of the main house, my house, watching a group of troubled teens from a local youth program lead a rescued Mustang through the paddock. The air was clean, the tension was gone, and the rotten foundation Silas had built had been physically and spiritually replaced. Silas Blackwood had been sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Without his wealth to buffer him, the king of Montana found that in prison his name meant less than nothing. His brother-in-law, Jim Van Camp, followed him shortly after, convicted of racketeering and supplying substandard materials to government-funded projects. The Montgomery family didn't escape the blast radius either. The Montgomery bank scandal broke when investigators realized Preston and his father had been complicit in hiding Silas's offshore assets. Their stock plummeted, and Preston was forced to resign in disgrace. Last I heard, he was selling used luxury cars in Las Vegas, a far cry from the king he thought he was at the altar. The final encounter. I was in the city for a board meeting when I saw her. I was exiting a high-end office building in downtown Billings when a woman approached me. She was wearing a faded waitress uniform from a nearby diner. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her face, once glowing with the arrogance of the elite, looked tired and weathered. It was Clara. "Ethan," she said, her voice lacking its former edge. She looked at my suit, then at the black SUV waiting for me with a driver. I heard what you did with the ranch. A sanctuary? My father would be turning in his grave." "That was the point, Clara," I said, stopping for a moment. "The land belongs to the living now, not to a ghost of a name." "I'm working double shifts at the Rusty Spur," she said, clutching her apron. "I'm living in a studio apartment above a garage. I have $10 in my bank account. Do you know what it's like to have everyone look at you and whisper, 'There goes the fraud'?" "I know exactly what it's like to be looked down on, Clara.
I spent 3 years being your handyman while you and your friends laughed behind my back. The difference is I had a foundation of character. You only had a foundation of credit." She looked at the ground. "Preston won't even take my calls. He sent me a cease and desist letter. I have nobody." "You have yourself. That's what you told me you wanted, right? To be with someone of your station? Well, your station is now reality. I hope it treats you better than you treated me." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single crumpled $100 bill, the one Preston had thrown at my feet in the chapel. I'd kept it as a reminder. I handed it to her. "For the trouble, Clara, buy yourself a new perspective." I didn't wait for her to respond. I stepped into the SUV and closed the door. As we drove away, I saw her in the window standing on the sidewalk of a city that used to belong to her, holding a bill that represented the very arrogance that destroyed her. The architect's new plan. The handyman was gone. The architect had finished his masterpiece. I spent that evening back at the ranch sitting on a fence post as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The horses were calm, the staff was happy, and the debt was paid, not just in money, but in justice. I'd built a house that couldn't be shaken because it wasn't held together by greed or fraud. It was held together by the truth. And as I looked at my calloused hands, I realized they weren't dirt-stained. They were the hands of a man who knew how to build, how to destroy, and most importantly, how to rise from the ashes.